I will never forget the night I came home from my late hospital shift and saw my parents nearly frozen on the front steps of the house that was supposed to be mine. The snow had been falling steadily for hours, coating every tree branch and driveway in a thick crust of white, and the wind whipped hard enough to sting my face through my scarf. At first, I thought the two shapes on the porch were piles of snow someone had shoveled and abandoned, but when I got closer, my stomach dropped. It was my father slumped against the railing, his lips turning blue, his chest heaving shallow breaths while my mother crouched beside him, banging weakly on the locked door with her bare hand. Her voice was hoarse, pleading, almost gone, and she looked up at me with eyes full of both shame and desperation. "Rachel," she whispered, "we can't get inside." My father groaned, clutching at his chest, and his breath came in ragged gasps that I recognized instantly from my training as a nurse. He was on the edge of a cardiac episode. I threw my bag down and dropped to my knees in the snow, fumbling for my phone with trembling fingers. I dialed 911 while I wrapped my coat around my father, trying to generate even a little heat. Inside the house through the windows, I could see golden light and the flicker of a chandelier, hear the thump of music, and the high laughter of women clinking their glasses. I knew that laugh. It belonged to Monica, my sister-in-law. She was hosting a party wearing silken jewelry, pouring champagne, while my parents nearly froze to death 10 feet away on the porch. As I shouted our address to the dispatcher, I heard footsteps, and suddenly the front door opened a crack. The heat and music spilled out, and there stood Monica in a sequined dress, her smile curling with disgust. Behind her, the living room was crowded with guests, holding plates of food and glasses of wine, the table covered in expensive catering. Monica looked at my father slumped on the ground and my mother clutching him, and instead of shock or concern, she rolled her eyes. "Oh, didn't they tell you?" she said loud enough for the guests behind her to hear. "This is a private party, not for your kind." Then she shut the door again, the lock snapping into place, leaving us in the howling wind. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone as the dispatcher repeated that an ambulance was on the way. My mother sobbed, pressing her forehead against my father's shoulder, and I screamed through the door, pounding with my fists until my knuckles went raw. "Open the door. He's having a heart attack." But all I heard was the bass of the music turned louder, drowning us out. I could see shadows of guests dancing, plates of food being passed around, while outside my father's skin grew paler and his lips deepened to a frightening purple. I pulled him into my lap, whispering, "Stay with me. Dad, please, just a little longer." My breath came out in clouds that mixed with his shallow ones, and I realized tears had frozen on my cheeks. The blue lights of the ambulance finally broke through the storm, the siren wailing, and 2 EMTs rushed out with a stretcher. They pushed past me, checked my father's pulse, and shouted, "He's crashing! Get the oxygen now!" As they lifted him, I saw one of the guests peek through the curtains inside wineglass in hand, then retreat quickly as if we were a shameful scene not worth noticing. The door never opened again. The EMT strapped a mask over my father's face, and I climbed into the ambulance holding my mother's hand. She kept repeating, "Why would they do this to us?" Why I had no answer. My heart pounded with both terror and rage because deep down I already knew the reason. This was not an accident. This was cruelty deliberate and cold, and I was not going to let them get away with it. When the ambulance doors slammed shut and the siren wailed, I sat gripping my mother's trembling hand and felt my whole life collapse inward. As the EMTs worked on my father, attaching wires and pressing oxygen over his mouth, I stared at his face and realized how much of my existence was built on the sacrifices of these two people. My father, Daniel Carter, had been a steelworker in Cleveland for 30 years, his hands permanently scarred from sparks and metal. My mother, Linda, had waited tables at diners and cleaned offices at night, just to keep food on the table. We never had much, but they gave me everything they could, even when it meant going without themselves. I grew up hearing my father's boots hit the porch at dawn and seeing my mother fall asleep over a sewing machine because she was patching clothes for neighbors to earn a few extra dollars. They taught me to study to work, to believe I could climb beyond the poverty line. Every A I got in school was taped on the refrigerator. Every shift I pulled at the hospital, every patient I helped was because they believed in me enough to carry me there. I remember nights when the electricity bill was overdue and they lit candles pretending it was family fun, so I would not be ashamed. I remember my father carrying me on his shoulders through snowdrifts because my boots had holes, and he told me stories of steel mills and pride. I remember my mother sneaking sandwiches into my backpack when she thought I was not looking, whispering, "Rachel, you will never go hungry, not while I'm alive." They were not perfect people, but they were mine, and they gave more love than money could ever buy. By the time I turned 25, I had graduated nursing school and found a position in a surgical unit at Metro Health Medical Center. I was proud they were proud, and even though I rented a tiny apartment, it felt like the world had opened up. When I brought them flowers for their anniversary, my mother cried, saying she never imagined her daughter could do this much. My father just hugged me so tight I could hardly breathe, whispering, "You made it farther than I ever dreamed, baby girl." But behind those moments of joy, there was always a shadow waiting. The shadow came in the form of David Miller, the man I married at 27. At first, he seemed like a dream, educated, polished, working at a bank. Compared to my rough childhood, his world of dinners, suits, and polished words felt intoxicating. My parents welcomed him cautiously, maybe too politely, desperate not to be judged by his wealthier family. His mother Helen arrived at our modest engagement dinner wearing pearls and looking around our kitchen like she had stepped into a barn. She smiled tightly and said, "At least David won't starve with a nurse around." His sister Monica drank too much wine and laughed. "Guess we'll have to teach Rachel how to dress for real parties." I laughed along, pretending not to care, but inside, something twisted. My parents caught it too. Later that night, my father warned me, "Rachel, they look down on us. Be careful." I brushed it off, eager to believe love was enough. The wedding was a blur of lace and vows, but I noticed the way Helen sneered when my mother hugged me too tightly and how Monica deliberately skipped taking photos with my parents. The Millers hosted a grand reception in their country club, complete with champagne fountains and a string quartet, while my parents hovered near the buffet like outsiders at their own daughter's celebration. I told myself it was nerves or class differences or just me overthinking. I should have listened to my father. Over time, the differences became cracks. David's family had money-old connections, and they never let me forget I came from nothing. At every holiday, Helen would make snide remarks about my parents' clothes or their small talk. Monica once told me, "You should be grateful we accepted you. Plenty of women want my brother." My parents endured it silently, always telling me, "Don't make trouble, honey. We're fine." But I saw the way their smiles faltered, the way my mother held my hand longer after each dinner as if to ask, "Are you sure this is the life you want?" I thought about that now in the back of the ambulance, listening to the machine beep as it monitored my father's fragile heart. I thought about the sacrifices of two people who had never once locked a door on me, never once treated me like less. And I thought about how that same love had been thrown back in their faces by the people I had led into my life. My parents deserved warmth, safety, and respect. Instead, they had been humiliated, left to freeze outside a house that bore my name on the mortgage. Rage burned in me so fiercely it almost drowned my fear. I promised myself as I squeezed my mother's hand that no matter what happened tonight, I would not let this betrayal stand. My father had carried me through the snow when I was small. Now it was my turn to carry him and to make every one of them pay for what they had done. I met David Miller when I was 26, still working exhausting double shifts at the hospital, sleeping in my car between rotations because I was too tired to drive home. He was sitting in the ER waiting room, not as a patient, but as a visitor, impeccably dressed in a suit, scrolling on his phone. We started talking while I grabbed a coffee, and he seemed charming in a way that felt like sunlight after years of fluorescent bulbs and antiseptic hallways. He told me he worked at a bank, that he admired nurses because we carried the weight of other people's lives. I remember blushing because no one had ever said it like that before. Our first dates were dinners at places I had only seen in magazines, white tablecloths, waiters in black vests, menus with no prices. I felt clumsy, unsure how to order, but David made me laugh, told me I deserved to be spoiled. When he kissed me outside my apartment, I thought maybe all the hard years of watching my parents break their backs had finally given me something good. My parents were cautious but supportive. My mother baked her best lemon pie the first time she invited David over. My father cleaned the yard twice just to make sure it looked neat. David ate politely complimented everything, but I noticed how he glanced at the worn curtains, the old couch patched with tape, the kind of things I grew up blind to. The first time I met his family was different. Helen, his mother, greeted me with a cool handshake, her pearl bracelet sliding down her wrist as if to remind me of what separated us. "So, Rachel, a nurse," she said, her smile thin. "Well, at least David won't have to worry about insurance." Monica, his older sister, hugged me loosely, then whispered, "He usually dates lawyers." At dinner, they discussed vacations to Europe and stocks, while I tried to keep up my voice shaking when I described my hospital schedule. My parents' names never came up, as if they were invisible. When David proposed a year later with a diamond ring that sparkled like ice, I cried and said yes. I wanted to believe love could bridge any gap. The wedding was beautiful on the surface. Roses, a rented hall, everyone dressed like they belonged in a glossy magazine. But even that day carried cracks I tried to ignore. My father walked me down the aisle in his only suit, the cuffs worn, his hands rough against the silk of my dress. He was proud, but I saw the way Helen sniffed when he kissed my cheek, the way Monica refused to stand next to my mother in the photos. My parents stayed close to me all evening, but I knew they felt out of place among the glittering guests. After we married, David wanted us to move closer to his family into a house his parents helped us find. It was larger than anything I dreamed of, with hardwood floors and a manicured lawn, but it also meant his family was never far. Every Sunday became mandatory dinners at Helen's, where she compared my cooking to Monica's, or made jokes about my hospital scrubs fashion. At first, David would squeeze my hand under the table, but soon he stopped laughing with them instead. When my parents visited, they were treated like ghosts. Helen would nod without offering them drinks. Monica would make pointed comments like, "It must be hard keeping up with our lifestyle." My mother would smile tightly. My father would stay quiet, and I would burn with shame. I began to notice how David changed when his family was around. At home, he could be sweet, even tender, but in their presence he became sharper, more critical. If I mentioned being tired from a 12-hour shift, he said, "Monica works longer hours and doesn't complain." If I suggested inviting my parents for dinner, he shrugged. They wouldn't fit in. One night, after Helen criticized the way I set the table, I snapped back, saying my mother had taught me, and David pulled me aside afterward, his voice cold. "Don't embarrass me like that again." That was the first time I felt the sting of warning, the first ripple of fear that maybe I had stepped into something I could not control. Still, I told myself love was compromise. I told myself families took time. But deep down in the silence after their parties, I could hear my father's warning echo. They looked down on us. Be careful. And though I tried to bury it, I knew he was right. The marriage that had once felt like a door opening was beginning to feel like a trap, slowly tightening around me, a trap built not by strangers, but by the very people who now shared my last name. The red flags began as whispers small enough that I could almost convince myself they were harmless. Helen would call our house on weekdays, insisting she needed David to run errands for her. If I asked why she couldn't hire help, she said smoothly, "Family takes care of family." That phrase started to sound less like warmth and more like a command. Monica dropped by uninvited, walking through our living room with a glass of wine in hand, commenting on every detail. "These curtains look cheap," she said once. "You should let me take you shopping." When I told her I liked them, she laughed. No wonder David needs my guidance. At first, David defended me weakly, saying she didn't mean it, but soon he stopped. It was easier for him to agree with them. When I cooked dinner, Helen would wrinkle her nose and say, "Monica makes lamb better." When I set the table, Monica would swap out plates, muttering, "This is how it should look." If I protested, David whispered, "Don't overreact. They just want to help." Gaslighting. That word hadn't entered my vocabulary yet, but the feeling of being slowly erased, doubted, diminished, it settled over me like a shroud. Finances became the next battlefield. David suggested we combine accounts for efficiency. I agreed at first, believing marriage meant partnership, but soon I discovered transactions I never approved. Thousands withdrawn under vague labels, deposits redirected to family investments. When I confronted him, he brushed me off. "It's my money too. Why are you being so controlling?" I felt dizzy from the reversal. How had I become the controlling one when money I worked for was vanishing into his family's pockets? The worst part was the way they treated my parents. Every time I invited them over, Helen made excuses. When they did visit, Monica made them sit at the far end of the table, peppering them with condescending questions. "So, Mr. Carter, how's retirement? Must be hard with prices these days." My father, proud but polite, would answer simply. My mother tried to join conversations but was always cut off. Afterward, she would hug me tightly at the door, whispering, "Don't worry about us." We're used to being invisible. Each word carved deeper into me. The gaslighting intensified. When I told David how hurt I felt, he sighed. "You're too sensitive. My family's just trying to help us succeed. You should be grateful." Grateful for being mocked in my own home, for watching my parents shrink under their contempt. I began to question myself. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was too emotional. That's how they wanted me to feel, confused, uncertain, doubting my own reality. Then came the first physical crack. It was during a Thanksgiving dinner at Helen's house. My parents had brought a homemade pumpkin pie, proud of the contribution. Monica placed it on the sideboard untouched while she served a store-bought cheesecake from an upscale bakery. When my father asked if anyone wanted a slice, Monica smirked. "We don't usually eat that kind of thing." Laughter rippled down the table. My father's face went red, his fork clattering against the plate. I snapped. "That pie is better than anything on this table, and you're all too arrogant to see it." The room went silent. Helen's eyes narrowed. Monica's smile twisted, and David grabbed my arm hard under the table. His nails dug into my skin as he hissed, "Not here." Later that night, when guests were gone, he slammed the car door and turned on me. "You embarrassed me. You embarrassed my family. Don't you ever talk back like that again." His hand came down fast across my cheek. For a second, the world went white and I tasted blood. He apologized afterward, muttering about stress, promising it would never happen again. But the damage was done. The red flags had turned into sirens blaring in my head. I began to notice the patterns more clearly. Monica deliberately scheduled parties when I had long shifts, so I would show up late, exhausted, looking disheveled compared to her polished friends. Helen criticized my parents' clothes, comparing them to charity cases. David accused me of making everything about myself when I tried to defend them. I felt trapped in a cage built from ridicule, control, and violence, and each bar was welded tighter by their voices telling me it was all in my head. Still, I clung to hope. I told myself I could endure it for the sake of peace, that love would eventually outweigh cruelty. But in quiet moments, when I looked in the mirror and saw the faint bruise fading on my cheek, I knew hope was slipping away. My parents had spent their lives sacrificing so I could stand tall. And here I was shrinking, being hollowed out piece by piece. Something inside me whispered that this could not last, that one day the bars of this cage would snap. I just did not know yet how brutal that snap would be. The bruise on my cheek faded, but the memory of David's hand never did. It became a silent warning hanging over every word I spoke. I measured my tone carefully, weighing whether Helen or Monica would twist it, whether David's jaw would tighten the way it did before anger spilled over. What had started as sharp words now carried the threat of something heavier, and I lived in constant fear of the snap I knew would come again. The insults grew bolder. Monica began mocking my shifts at the hospital, calling me the tired nurse in front of dinner guests. Helen critiqued every move my parents made, whispering to David loud enough for me to hear, "They don't belong in our circle." At first, David would only sigh, but then he started echoing them. "Maybe they are embarrassing," he said one night when I begged him to stand up for me. I stared at him, searching for the man who once admired me, but his eyes were cold. The financial control tightened. One afternoon, I discovered a withdrawal slip, $40,000 gone from our joint account. When I confronted David, my hands shaking, he told me Helen needed it for an investment opportunity. "She knows what she's doing," he insisted. I demanded the money be returned. His face hardened. "You're not in charge here, Rachel. Don't make this a fight." When I pressed, he slammed his fist against the wall beside my head. Plaster cracked, dust showering my shoulder. "Enough," he barked. I froze, pulse hammering, realizing the line between intimidation and outright violence had thinned to nothing. My parents remained my only refuge, though even they were dragged into the line of fire. One evening, they invited us over for dinner, desperate to maintain some connection. My mother cooked her best roast chicken. My father set the table with mismatched plates, proud to host us. When David and I arrived, Monica had tagged along uninvited. She looked around their small kitchen and sneered. "This place smells like poverty." My father's knuckles whitened on his fork, but he said nothing, swallowing the humiliation. I snapped, "Leave if you don't like it." Monica only smirked. Later that night, back at our house, David cornered me in the kitchen. His hand clamped my wrist so hard I cried out, "Do not talk to my sister like that." He growled, squeezing until I thought my bone might snap. When he finally let go, a red ring circled my skin like a brand. The emotional game sharpened. If I tried to spend time with my parents, David accused me of neglecting him. If I questioned his spending, he called me ungrateful. If I flinched when he raised his hand, he mocked me for being dramatic. "You want bruises?" He sneered once, lifting his fist, then lowering it with a laugh. "That's what you get for acting hysterical." His words wrapped around me tighter than any chain. I began to doubt every step, every thought. Was I losing my mind? Was I truly the problem? Then came the night everything snapped further. It was late after a party Helen had hosted. My parents had been ignored all evening, seated at the far edge of the room as if they were strangers. I tried to talk to them, but Monica pulled David away to introduce him to business partners, leaving me stranded. When we returned home, I broke down. "I can't keep doing this," I cried. "They're humiliating my parents. They're humiliating me. You're letting it happen." David poured himself a drink, calm as ever, and said, "If you don't like it, maybe you should stop bringing them." Something inside me shattered. I told him I would not abandon my parents. His eyes narrowed, and before I could step back, his hand flew across my face. The sting lit my skin like fire. I stumbled, hit the counter, tasted blood again. He didn't apologize this time. He only muttered, "You pushed me too far," and walked away. I pressed ice to my cheek, shaking with rage and fear. In that moment, I understood the trap fully. They had gaslit me, isolated me, drained our finances, and now the abuse had turned physical. My parents' dignity was being crushed because of my marriage, and my own body was becoming collateral damage. But beneath the terror, something else burned, a spark of defiance. I would not let their cruelty destroy me or the people who had given me everything. I did not know how yet, but I swore there would come a day when Helen's pearls, Monica's smirk, and David's fists would all meet the weight of justice. The night that broke everything open came in December, a bitter storm slamming against the windows, snow piling knee-high against curbs, the kind of cold that steals your breath the moment you step outside. I had just finished a 14-hour shift at the hospital. My body ached. My scrubs clung damp with sweat, and all I wanted was the comfort of seeing my parents for the holiday gathering David's family had insisted on hosting at our house. But when I pulled into the driveway, the sight that greeted me froze me harder than the wind ever could. My parents were huddled on the front porch, their thin coats crusted with snow, their skin ghostly under the porch light. My mother knelt beside my father, who lay slumped against the railing, his lips tinged a terrifying blue. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven gasps, each one a fight against collapse. My mother's bare hands pounded weakly on the locked door, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Please let us in. Please, someone." She broke off when she saw me, her face a mask of desperation and shame. "Rachel," she croaked, "we've been out here for hours." I dropped everything, stumbling through the snow to reach them. My father's pulse fluttered faintly beneath my fingers. His breath rattled, wheezing like a broken machine. My training as a nurse screamed at me he was minutes away from cardiac arrest. I yanked off my coat and wrapped it around him, my own body trembling as I tried to shield him from the wind. My mother clutched my sleeve, sobbing. They wouldn't open the door. They laughed. And then, as if to prove her words true, the door creaked open a sliver. Warmth spilled out golden light from chandeliers, the thump of music, the sharp scent of wine and roasted meat. Standing there was Monica, dressed in a sequined gown that glittered like ice. She glanced down at my father collapsed in the snow, then at my mother shivering beside him. Her mouth curled in disgust. "Oh," she said loudly enough for the guests behind her to hear. "Didn't they tell you this is a private party? Not for your kind." Laughter rippled from inside. Then the door slammed shut, the lock clicking into place. I pounded on the wood until my knuckles split, screaming, "He's dying! Open the door!" No answer. Only music turned louder, bass vibrating through the glass, drowning out my cries. Through the curtains, I saw silhouettes raising glasses, dancing, eating food paid for with money stolen from me. One guest peeked out, saw us on the porch, then turned away quickly, as if we were vermin on the doorstep. My father groaned, his eyes rolling back. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for my phone, my frozen fingers dialing 911. "1. My father is having a heart attack," I shouted into the receiver. "Send an ambulance now, please hurry." The dispatcher's calm voice steadied me enough to keep pressing on his chest, trying to coax each fragile breath into something stronger. My mother's sobs cracked against the howling wind. She whispered, "Why would they do this to us? What did we ever do?" I had no answer. My tears froze on my cheeks as I bent over my father, whispering, "Stay with me, Dad. Don't you dare leave me. Not like this." The blue lights came slicing through the snow, at last, the wail of sirens echoing down the street. EMTs rushed out their boots, crunching over the ice equipment bags, slamming onto the ground. One of them knelt beside me, checked my father's pulse, and shouted, "He's crashing!" "Get the oxygen." They hoisted him onto a stretcher, strapping a mask over his face, wires tangling around his chest. As they worked, I caught sight of Helen through the window, standing behind the curtains. She looked straight at me, then drew the fabric closed without a flicker of emotion. I climbed into the ambulance beside my mother, clutching her hand as she shook uncontrollably. The inside smelled of antiseptic and adrenaline machines beeping in frantic rhythm with my father's failing heart. One EMT squeezed a bag of oxygen, another shouted vitals into a radio. My mother pressed her forehead against his shoulder, whispering prayers through her sobs. "Don't take him from me. Please, God, don't take him." At the hospital, the ER burst into chaos. Doctors rushed him into a bay, nurses swarming with IV lines and monitors. I stood frozen, torn between nurse and daughter. My professional instincts clashing with the terror that this was my father, not a patient. A doctor barked orders epinephrine now, and the room filled with the sharp smell of alcohol swabs and the metallic click of defibrillator pads. They shocked him once, his body jerking, then again. On the third jolt, his heart stuttered back into rhythm. A weak but steady beep filled the air. Relief collapsed me against the wall. Hours later, when my father was finally stable, the doctor pulled me aside. His voice was firm. "If you had been 10 minutes later, he might not have survived. Exposure like that in this weather, he's lucky to be alive." My knees buckled. 10 minutes. 10 minutes stood between life and death, and my in-laws had chosen to laugh. I walked into the waiting room where my mother sat wrapped in a hospital blanket, her face pale, her hands still trembling. She looked at me with hollow eyes. "They locked us out, Rachel. They watched us suffer." I knelt beside her, taking her hands in mine, feeling the raw skin where she had pounded on the door. "I know, Mom," I whispered, "and I promise you they will pay for this." That night, as I sat beside my father's hospital bed, listening to the steady beep of the monitor, rage boiled in me like molten steel. My parents had given everything so I could stand tall, and those people, those parasites, had nearly killed him. I thought of Monica's sneer, Helen's cold eyes, David's silence that spoke louder than any word. They had crossed a line that could never be forgiven. And as I watched my father's chest rise and fall, fragile but alive, I made a vow as sharp as broken glass. This was no longer about enduring, no longer about keeping peace. It was about justice. They had tried to destroy my family. Now it was my turn to destroy theirs. After the hospital, everything shifted into a new, sharper light. While my father rested on the monitor and my mother slept in a chair with a blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, I began to pick up the threads of the night and pull. Little things that had been nagging me into corners of doubt suddenly fit together like a puzzle. The catering receipts, the way the valet had parked unfamiliar cars in our drive, the hurried calls David had made the week before the party, none of it felt accidental. I went home that night with my head full of questions and a notebook clutched like an anchor. I wanted facts, not fury, and facts were what would turn the anger into something that could change the world. The first thing I did was log into our joint accounts from the bedside computer the hospital offered for family use because I could no longer stand wondering what had been taken. The transactions were a map of Betrayal, $40,000 withdrawn 3 days before the party labeled vaguely as home improvements, a transfer of $22,000 to a catering company with a name I recognized as one of the city's upscale vendors, and another deposit to an LLC that when I traced it belonged to one of Walter's shell companies. My hands shook so badly I almost deleted something by accident. As I took screenshots and printed out statements from an online banking kiosk the social worker let me use, I felt like I was stealing back pieces of my life. Next, I went through our home. With the house cleared and the guests gone, I walked room by room collecting evidence. In the guest suite closet, I found garment bags with Monica's initials stitched into the tags and a perfume bottle that matched the one she had worn that night. In the attic, I discovered contractor estimates and a half-signed contract for a guest suite renovation with dates stamped weeks before we moved in. In David's home office, in the bottom drawer of his desk, I unearthed a folder labeled Address Change with Helen and Walter's names on a partially completed form. Someone had started the paperwork to list our house as a second residence under their control. The nausea rolled through me like a wave. They had been planning to colonize our home the same way they colonized conversations and holidays, slow, deliberate, and without consent. I recorded a conversation I had with Monica a week later on my way to the hospital after I had mustered the courage to ask her directly about the party money. She laughed when I mentioned the catering costs, her voice flippant. "Oh, honey, it was just a little celebration. You should be grateful for the attention." When I pressed about who paid, she waved a manicured hand and said David's father picked up the tab. "Consider it an investment." I saved the recording. When I confronted David, he sputtered excuses that fell apart when I produced the bank statements and his own handwriting on the contractor quote. He first denied, then stammered, and finally admitted they had taken control of certain decisions without meaning to hurt anyone. His face was pale and small. I realized his silence that night on the porch had been not just cowardice, but complicity. I went to Vanessa, my friend and a paralegal, and she helped me draft a list of documents I would need. Bank statements, medical reports from the ER, eyewitness accounts, and any recorded conversations. Vanessa warned me to be careful. People like Helen and Monica were practiced at erasing traces. "You need a lawyer who understands elder abuse and financial exploitation," she said bluntly. I made 3 calls, and the third connected me to Hannah Brooks, who specialized in elder law and domestic exploitation. Hannah listened with a quiet clinical focus that made me feel less like a hysteric and more like a client with a case. "This is financial abuse and potentially elder endangerment," she said. "We have evidence that can support a civil suit and possibly criminal charges if we can show intent to harm or neglect." Her words were precise and heavy in my chest. With Hannah's help, I filed a formal complaint with the police and opened a civil suit for recovery of the withdrawn funds and damages for the humiliation and endangerment. The detectives who took my statement were professional. They photographed the porch where my father had lain, recorded the timeline of the party, and asked for copies of the receipts I had collected. They subpoenaed the catering company and began tracking the paper trail that led from our bank to the event planner and then to the Miller family accounts. News of the complaint spread quietly at first, then louder when the detective told me they had enough to warrant further investigation. I expected denials, and denials came. Helen's attorney issued a statement calling us distraught family members and suggested the withdrawal was a misunderstanding. But the bank records were immovable. The contractor quotes and the half-signed address form were physical proof. The recorded voice of Monica, flippant and unashamed, was a dagger I kept polished. The legal process moved like a machine, grinding sometimes slow, sometimes rapid, but always forward. My anger cooled into focus. My grief solidified into the kind of determination that no amount of social polish could wash away. I had a dossier in my hands that not only explained how they had nearly killed my father by leaving him outside, it showed how their greed and sense of entitlement had orchestrated it down to the receipts. They had assumed their status insulated them from consequences. They were about to find out otherwise. Once Hannah and the detectives laid out the next steps, a strange calm settled over me. It was the calm of someone who had finally chosen a weapon instead of simply taking blows. For months, I had been gaslit into believing I was fragile, emotional, irrational. But now I had evidence stacked in neat folders, recordings labeled and timed medical charts signed by doctors and photographs of the porch where my father nearly died. Each piece was a nail, and I was building a coffin for their arrogance. The Millers tried to circle their wagons. Helen called my phone twice, leaving clipped voicemails. "Rachel, you're making a fool of yourself. We were only trying to help. Withdraw the complaint before this gets ugly." Monica sent me a text that I screenshotted before deleting. "You'll regret this. Family doesn't turn on family." I stared at the words and thought of my father's blue lips, my mother's bleeding knuckles. No, they had turned on us first. David oscillated between begging and threats. One night he came home drunk, collapsing onto the couch. He slurred, "We can fix this, Rach. Just drop the charges. Mom will pay back the money. It's not worth ruining everything." When I refused, he stood up, his face twisting with rage. "You think you can beat us? You're nothing without me. Nothing." I pressed record on my phone as he shouted, capturing every word. When he raised his hand again, I didn't flinch. I stared back coldly and whispered, "Do it. One more bruise and I'll take you down harder than all of them." His hand trembled, then dropped. For the first time, he looked afraid of me. The legal process gathered momentum. The subpoena forced the catering company to release invoices showing the payment trail straight from our account. The contractor testified that Helen had met with him personally to discuss renovations using David's authorization. My bank confirmed the withdrawals were authorized on our joint account but flagged by internal compliance as unusual. It was a mountain of proof, and Hannah knew exactly how to arrange it into an avalanche. When the hearing date was set, word leaked to the local press. A headline ran in the Cleveland Plain, "Dealer Prominent Family Accused of Elder Neglect Financial Misuse." My phone lit up with messages from co-workers who had met Helen or Monica at parties, their shock almost comical. At the hospital, my colleagues whispered, "Is it true? Did they really leave your parents outside?" The story was spreading, and for once it wasn't me who looked small, it was them. The night before court, I visited my parents. My father was still weak, walking with a cane, but he gripped my hand firmly. "Are you sure about this, Rachel?" he asked, his voice raspy. "They'll come after you harder than before." My mother's eyes brimmed with worry, but I shook my head. "They already tried to destroy us. Tomorrow is the first day they start paying for it." My father squeezed my hand, pride flickering through his exhaustion. "Then make it count." Walking into the courthouse the next morning felt like stepping into a battlefield. Helen sat stiff-backed in a navy suit, Monica beside her with lips pressed into a defiant line. David slumped like a man half defeated. Their lawyer, slick and sharp, flipped through a binder. Hannah leaned close to me and whispered, "Remember, you're not alone. We have the truth. That's stronger than their money." I nodded, clutching the folder of evidence like armor. When the judge entered the room, fell silent. My heart pounded as the charges were read: elder endangerment, financial exploitation fraud. Each word echoed like a drumbeat. Helen's face blanched. Monica's jaw tightened. David avoided my eyes. When Hannah rose to present our case, she began with the photograph of my father on the stretcher oxygen mask covering his face. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Then came the receipts, the bank transfers, the recordings. Each piece was a hammer blow. As I watched the Millers squirm, a strange clarity filled me. This was not just revenge. This was justice. Every sneer, every slap, every locked door they had built this moment themselves, and I was going to make sure they never forgot it. The courtroom that day smelled of paper and disinfectant and a kind of expectation that made my stomach flip. News vans idled outside the stone steps, and when the doors opened, a small crowd trickled in, neighbors, a few reporters and people I thought I recognized from David's mother's social circle there to see whether the scandal would swallow them whole. Helen sat rigid in the front row, pearls clinging like armor. Monica's makeup was heavy and fierce, the way someone dresses for battle. David's face had thinned into something hollow. His hands trembled as he gripped his lawyer's notes. I carried my folder of evidence into the stand the way a soldier would carry a standard, steady, focused, unnerving to everyone watching. Hannah spoke first, her voice even and unyielding. She laid out the timeline with surgical clarity, dates of withdrawals the day the locks were changed, the hours my parents spent outside the medical report confirming hypothermia and cardiac distress, the catering invoice, the contractor's quote, the address, change form. She played the recording of Monica's laugh and the offhand remark about private parties that had been our first humiliation. Each item was simple, factual, ordinary until Hannah arranged them into a pattern of intent. The judge listened with the trained patience of someone who weighs reputations and lives. When Hannah finished, the room felt smaller, the miller's gleam dimmed by reality. Then the defense rose. They tried the old rehearsed moves, minimize, reframe attack, the messenger. Helen's lawyer called my actions an emotional overreaction, insisted the money had been a gift, and that any inconvenience to my parents had been an unfortunate misunderstanding. Monica's attorney argued she had no intent to harm, that she had been insensitive but not criminal. They painted us as a fractious family that had blown a private spat into public drama. But Hannah's cross-examination kept circling back to evidence they could not rewrite the bank timestamps, the signed contractor estimate, the security footage that showed my father on the steps for the length of time my phone logs corroborated. The footage was the worst for them. Helen's face, watching from behind curtains. Monica turning away, a man in a tuxedo, glancing fleetingly through the blinds, and then retreating. It was damning because it was ordinary. It required no motive beyond entitlement, and that made it worse. When the prosecutor called witnesses, emotions filled the air like static. The EMT who had worked on my father described the frost on his lips and the pallor of someone who had been close to dying. The caterer testified about the invoice and the unusual billing instructions. A neighbor came forward and said she had seen the guests through the window and that no one had come to the door to check on my parents. Each witness tightened the net. Monica's face changed color. Helen's fingers dug into the arm of her chair. David's lawyer tried to separate him from the actions of his family. He was uncertain he was misled, but then David's own text messages, which Hannah introduced, showed him coordinating logistics and discussing payments. His silence that night was not ignorance. It was complicity. Throughout the hearing, I felt a strange steadiness. When Hannah asked me to describe the moment I found my parents on the porch, I told the truth plainly about the blue lips, the pounding on the door, Monica's laugh, the ambulance. I did not theatrically plead or collapse. I spoke as their daughter and as someone who had the receipts. The courtroom understood both roles. People leaned forward, cameras occasionally flashed. Somewhere in the back, a woman dabbed at her eyes. When it was over, the judge took a long time reading the verdict. The room thinned to a hush so absolute it was almost acoustic. Then his gavel cracked. The charges of financial exploitation and elder neglect were sustained. Helen was found culpable for authorizing withdrawals and orchestrating the party. Monica was found guilty of elder neglect and emotional abuse. David was found to have aided in the concealment of funds and enabling the events that led to my father's medical emergency. The legal language was precise and clinical guilty restitution restraining order, but the impact was visceral. Helen was ordered to pay significant restitution to cover medical bills and damages and to be barred from contact with my family. Monica received a sentence that included community service mandatory counseling and a period of probation. The court also imposed public records and fines severe enough to tarnish her social standing and finances. David was ordered to relinquish control over our joint accounts and to undergo mandatory anger management and financial oversight as part of a civil settlement. The headlines came quickly and with relish. Prominent family faces consequences after elder abuse case, read one banner. Social pages that once feted Helen now speculated about canceled memberships and lost board positions. Invitations to charities and clubs ceased to arrive. Monica's Instagram, once a glossy feed of parties and luxury brands, filled instead with comments from strangers outraged at her behavior. The Millers' social capital evaporated like sugar in rain. For them, the currency they prized most, status, was gone. The consequences were not only public. In private, David was fired from his bank position after HR investigated the ethics of his conduct, and the stain of the trial made him a liability. Helen faced lawsuits from other acquaintances who alleged similar manipulations, and the estate lawyers who once courted her retreated. Monica, stripped of the easy praise that fed her ego, attended mandated counseling sessions where she found for the first time no applause. I watched the fall with a complicated mixture of vindication and pity. Justice had a cost for everyone, and it was not a joy to see lives crumble even when they deserved the collapse. In the end, the legal system had done what my vows and anger could not. It had rendered a public accounting. My father's hospital bills were paid. Restitution was arranged, and a restraining order kept the Millers away. David's complicity was exposed, and our divorce was finalized with the court awarding me full ownership of the house and a settlement that secured my parents' future. Walking out of the courtroom that day, I did not feel triumphant in a petty way. I felt a sober, hard peace, the knowledge that I had protected my parents and reclaimed a life that had been inching away. Justice had not erased the trauma, but it had made a boundary impossible to ignore. If you harm my family, there is an answer, and that answer is exacting and real. The weeks after the verdict felt surreal, like walking through a house cleared of furniture. Everything familiar but rearranged in ways that forced new steps and new habits. The legal orders stayed in place. Restitution payments began to clear the medical bills, the restraining order kept Helen and Monica at a distance, and the court awarded me sole ownership of the house and a settlement that guaranteed my parents would be cared for. David's name was on fewer things by the day. HR at his bank terminated him quietly. His contacts thinned until his afternoons, once full of invitations, were empty. Invitations that had once defined Helen's social calendar disappeared. I watched their world shrink not with gloating but with a fierce satisfaction that the scale had finally tipped back toward what was right. At home, the work of rebuilding was intimate and ordinary. We repaired the porch where my father had lain, replacing the old railing and installing a heated welcome mat without announcement. Simple things that felt like reclaiming dignity. My father's cardiac function steadied. The cardiologist cleared him for light activity, and the nights of monitors and beeping machines became less frequent. My mother's hands, stiff from years of work, began to move with a little less pain after consistent care and physical therapy. Their laughs returned in small doses, a crooked joke over breakfast, an evening of old radio programs, my father bringing in a battered newspaper with a story circled proud like a boy. Those moments stitched the frayed parts of us back together. Divorce paperwork moved faster than I expected. It was not an act of vengeance so much as an act of survival. The judge finalized our separation, and the settlement ensured my parents' financial security. David left not only the marriage but the life our home had represented. He packed his suitcases and the echo of his apologies and walked out. For months, I had braced for the loneliness I thought would follow, but instead I found a steadier solitude, one that let me decide the pace of my days, the phrase on my voicemail, the people I invited in. The Millers faced consequences beyond legal penalties. Helen's board seats and charity ambassadorships were quietly rescinded. Monica's social media, once curated for envy, became a place where strangers called her out and old friends pulled away. It was not theatrical punishment. It was the slow social accounting that follows when a community recognizes harm. That recognition mattered to me because it told the story the court could not fit into a single judgment, that cruelty has ripple effects and networks built on entitlement will not always protect those who hide behind them. Friends and colleagues reached out in ways that surprised me. Nurses from my unit organized a small fundraiser to help with follow-up care. A neighbor brought a casserole and a note that said simply, "We saw. We're sorry it happened." Vanessa and Hannah visited their presence steadying. In the quiet evenings, my parents and I would sit with mugs of tea and talk about the absurdity of how quickly life had been altered. My father would pat my hand and say, "You did right, kiddo," and I would watch the lines on his face and feel gratitude that ran deeper than words. The settlement and the restraining orders did not erase the nights I cried or the bruises on my skin. They did not remove the hours my parents spent terrified on the porch. But the legal and social consequences created a new safety net, one built not from silence or compromise, but from accountability and law. In that net, my parents could breathe, and I could begin to plan a life where their dignity was never negotiable again. Healing arrived in fits and starts, not as a cinematic montage, but as a series of small decisions that added up over months. I started therapy the kind that asks for uncomfortable honesty and rewards it with steadier days. At first, the sessions were raw, naming the humiliation, naming the abuse, naming the guilt I had carried for bringing my parents into a house that had nearly killed my father. Over time, the sharp edges dulled. I learned to recognize the mechanisms of gaslighting and to trust the internal compass that had been muted for so long. My parents healed in their own ways. My father relearned the pleasure of a lazy Sunday breakfast and took to reading aloud from the sports page, his voice a rough comfort. My mother began volunteering at the community center 2 days a week, teaching a cooking class of old recipes that made people laugh and cry in equal measure. They were not the same as before that night on the porch scar tissue forms, but they were alive and allowed to be more than a moment of crisis. Watching them reclaim small joys was its own balm. I also began to change how I showed up at work and in my neighborhood. I used my voice where I had once swallowed it. I started a small support group with a few women from the hospital who had experienced boundary violations, an informal circle of shared stories and resources. We talked about signs, about emergency plans, about how to document financial exploitation. We practiced scripts for calling HR, for filing complaints, for taking pictures of suspicious activity. The meetings were private, but they gathered a boldness that had once felt impossible. My involvement grew more public when Hannah suggested I speak at a town hall about elder rights and domestic abuse. The first time I stepped up to a microphone, my palms sweated, my voice wobbling, but the room leaned in. I told the story plainly, no theatrics about the porch, the receipts, the slow erosion of trust. People came afterwards with their own names and stories, some weeping, some furious, all grateful that someone had turned a private nightmare into a public lesson. A local nonprofit asked me to help create an informational pamphlet on recognizing financial exploitation. We printed hundreds and distributed them at clinics and senior centers. There were moments of unexpected grace. A woman from Helen's former charity reached out to apologize for her silence and offered to help fund a home health aid for my mother when needed. A neighbor who had once been polite but distant brought over a box of winter blankets and said, "No one should be left on a porch in this weather." These gestures reminded me that community could also be repair, not just judgment. As months became a year, I found my voice in other ways. I took a class at the community college on nonprofit management so I could better support elder rights groups. I started mentoring a younger nurse who was engaged to a man her family insisted she accept. She told me the way I'd stood up made her believe she could set boundaries. My parents' Sunday dinners returned now, with guests chosen for warmth and respect rather than status. We laughed about small things, argued about recipes, and planned a summer picnic where there would be no talk of renovations or investments, only sandwiches, lemon pie, and the sound of feet on the lawn. The healing was not linear. Some days, old memories would appear uninvited, and a smell or a laugh would trigger a flash of cold. But those were no longer the only things that defined me. I had a life rebuilt on terms that I helped make. I had a family that was protected. I had a clarity about boundaries and an urgency to teach others what I'd learned the hard way. In the quiet evenings when the house was finally mine and the monitor beeps were faded into history, I would sit with my parents and say what we had all needed to hear for a long time: "We are safe now." My father would smile that crooked smile, and my mother would nod, and we would be in the simple, stubborn human way we always had been. Have you ever had to set a firm boundary with a family member? Share your story in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more real-life stories about standing up, reclaiming dignity, and protecting the people we love.